Hey everybody, BTO Pro, and today I'm going to be doing a search widget that filters results in Node.js because I need it like specifically spelled out, which is what I was going to do anyway, but not tell you until towards the end. No, I'm rude. So going back to Drew and our team card, just to recap what was worked on a previous one of these. Right, so we've got our card, which is implementing meme maker to demonstrate, hey, we can repurpose something. We've got prop drilling, where we take this property and we drill it down into here, right? And then that gets drilled down into there. So talked a little bit about event flow previously with searching, but haven't actually wired that up. So let's get the whole search kit and caboodle wired up. And then hopefully you can project into what you're building. Notice at the top of this, though, I still have a team roster that's managing this whole mess. Drew car is printed out multiple times because it is mapped using a lit array. So let's get cracking on it. On the coding side, right, we've got our Drew card, we've got our team roster. I'm going to make something new. We'll call this search widget. All right, search widget. And search widget is going to have import. It's going to be meme maker. It's going to be simple icon. All right, and then it has to be /lib/simple icon. I forget what it is. Simple icons. There we go. Okay, I don't know that I've included this, but this is part of your requirement. So, all right, here we're going to have a value. And this will be type string search. And if you're wondering why I'm doing this instead of stubbing code out, I don't know. This is just sort of the way that I always start working on these things. Sure. Usually taking something that already says that this value equals nothing, right? We've got value. Okay, we're going to make this very simple. It's going to be a simple icon, and the icon is going to be search, I believe. And then we're going to have an input field. And it just need to do that. And then we're going to have handle input, which is E. And that's exactly what I wanted. Now, I don't want the custom event to be search. Reading what's going on here, right? There's an input event. I'm listening. It's a self-closing tag. I'm listening for the input event, running this whenever the user has input of any kind. Then I'm going to set my value internally so that if I wanted to query search widget and figure out what the value currently is, I have a stateful way of doing that. Then I'm going to dispatch an event. It's not going to be called search. I'm going to actually name this value changed. And I'm not going to do any bubbling. It's just going to be, hey, bubble the event up. When the event bubbles up, that means something listening for that event, listening for value changed above me in the DOM, right? Because it's going to bounce up the DOM. Something listening for value changed could react and go at value hyphen changed and run its own function. And that function's e.target.value. Actually, it would be e.detail.value, not target.value in this case. But e.detail, that's what this is, right? The event is this whole object. That is the event data that is going to be made available. And then e.detail, because I'm stepping through the event, is going to give me this value. Now, a common way of doing this would also be to do like something like that, so that I'm getting e.detail.value. There's no convention there other than it must be in this detail area. That is the properties that I can send up. I have to have detail. It comes along with the spec. Now, a coworker of mine came up with this methodology. I'm not super keen on it, but just to see something alternate, it's just this. Value changed. Naturally, a value changed. The search widget is what this is. And when search widget bubbles up, you could then query and say, or not query, but you could say, oh, well, give me e.detail.value because I've got a reference to this. it's a little confusing. But an advantage to that could be if you actually want a reference to the search widget and the additional values, maybe there's other data on here other than just value. That could be a use for that. I'm not going to write it that way. I think it's a little confusing. Let's be as verbose as possible. All right, so I set value to whatever came up from the target being a reference to the input field, right? And this will give me the value. Now there's also value here, which would be if I set some default, it could be written in there. So if I just write default value, we can witness that. I need to rename these things. So it's going to be search widget. And then, and I've seen several people miss this, there has to be a custom elements dot define, right? And this is what tells the browser tag name, process it using this class, right? This code will run whenever the HTML sees that tag. Okay. I'm also going to do simple hyphen icon and sure it's in line block. And you can't change the width on it, but you can change it via a CSS variable. Now, the reason for that, if you've looked into the guts of how simple icon works, I don't expect you to, but if you did, it's a lot of SVG logic as far as remote loading the icon in question. So the other thing I'm going to do is now I need to make sure that I've got simple icon. Make sure we have simple icon so that that part will work. Let's also make sure, and I'm going to do some code for myself here, copy. I've mentioned it a couple times, but just so you see it in video form. Adding in this roll-up plugin copy will allow the simple icons to work when in vercel. The reason that that is needed is because simple icon just generally loads icons. We don't know what icon it's going to load. So if you change that value dynamically, the thing that's doing the processing so that your code works in a static form, because remember, this is not static code. This is interpreted code, and that's why we have to run start, which runs a dev environment, right? It's a server that's fake, that's taking and translating in real time references to things such as lit in a very generalized way, right? That is not a thing. There's no folder lit. In fact, you can see it there. It's located in attic storage, git, BTO Pro, Drew card, node modules, lit/index. We don't reference those directly. The tooling helps resolve that on the fly. When we're going to publish it statically, meaning it doesn't have tooling, rollup, which is the thing that bundles our code together, has to know what to go through and what all the assets that are used. It's why when you have a new URL, it's actually going to go and try to import this API roster thing. And a couple people pointed out that I have this incorrectly. So there we go. I fixed that as well. So when you are referencing a JSON file, it needs to be included in the final output. A way of signaling to the build routine that that file is required is to do that new URL thing. This is also why that's the case in the boilerplate with logo and the OpenWC project with the little spinny logo. In the case of API roster, that is something we're just referencing as a path, right? In fact, I'll just make it /guy/roster. That is just a hard-coded path, but it is a reference to our backend. So if that backend is live and it's going to go do its magic on vercel, we still need to reference it in this static form. If we say new URL, the bundler is going to go through and try to stitch everything together and actually bring along roster.js as a file, which could be problematic. How it relates to the icons are loaded dynamically. There is no hard-coded reference saying these 10 icons are here, right? The bundler can go through and say, hey, import, and it goes and gets all this stuff. So a way around that is we get this roll-up plugin copy. Now it goes in dev dependencies because we don't need this for the actual project to work. We need it for when we're doing this build tooling type of routine. So that if someone else leveraged my Drew card, they don't need this. In fact, ES build I have in the wrong place here, technically. It should go here because ES build is part of the build routine. It is not actually required to use my front end assets. It's required for me to work on the project itself, to develop it, the dependencies for development. That's what I'm getting here. If you mix and match them, it's still going to work, but then everyone else that would ever use DrewCard has to get this block. They're never installing this block if they're implementing your code and ingesting it. Key distinction there. So in order to get the icons to work, I'm going to roll up, and again, I'm going to just steal from past things that I've written. There we go. Okay. If you have Ubuntu, I can't even remember what that little plugin is. Copy queue. Sorry, it's called copy queue. It remembers everything that I've ever copy and pasted. It's pretty fantastic. Also, if you have a Mac on OS X, you can get Alfred, which is a plugin that kind of does a very similar thing. As an FYI. So now in rollup, which is going to get all the code and smash it together, and it traces the tree, it does tree shaking, which means it finds all the files not used and those fade away, and finds all the files that are used and go, oh, this is the code required for this to ship with the minimum amount of code loaded by our end user. Smash it all into one thing. In that, I'm importing copy, which is this code is Node.js. This gets very confusing. You have to be in the mindset of I'm in tooling land, or I'm in the thing the end user is going to get land, or I'm in backend server infrastructure land. Micro front end web development is not simple by any stretch of the imagination. And if you get lost along the way, I don't blame you. I was too until like 5 years ago. So this is going to run a series of plugins. So a cool thing with rollup is you can inform rollup how to discover assets. So it's got a whole bunch of ones in here by default, as well as compiling via Babel, which we mentioned Babel briefly, but Babel is going to take all of the code, the beautiful code you're all writing, and the operators that might not exist in current JavaScript, or in previous JavaScript standards. And in this case, it's going to say, compile the code so it works on the last 3 major versions of these platforms. That's pretty awesome. It's just going to figure out and do so in a rolling manner, right? Generally speaking, if you're within the last 3 releases of any of these, you've got like 99.9% of the internet. So anyway, copy. The copy plugin takes in an object that has targets, and it's an array of targets, and says, go into this folder, copy literally everything, even though it's not in the tree shaking, and put it in the dist directory. So this is enough to make sure that your icons work. So going back to the search widget, I'm setting the height and width of the icon. Let's make this 40 by 40 just to show that it just works. I've got value change. I've got an input tag, right? So imagine users typing in the search field. It's going to run this event, and then this event is going to broadcast value changed. So now what I want to do is actually use search widget, right? This is pretty much going to work for what I want. Notice I also haven't actually demoed the code. I just know it's going to work. So this search widget is going to go into the team roster. All right, the team roster has players. It has the team, which is just a string. I've got update roster, which some of you I see have written update roster, even though you're not loading a roster. A lot of you, fortunately, wrote like update badges, which is at least a little more accurate for your use case. So this dot players equals data, right? And the reason that we're able to render our many versions of Drew is, right, I've got Drew card and I'm printing and prop drilling these things down, but I've got this dot players, which is mapped. And this is the critical piece of that working with the map. So if you're not getting your values to print out, this would be why. That property, in this case, players, has to be in your properties declaration. It has to be an array. Then you have to set a default value of an empty array. This way, when you render the first time, nothing breaks. It just renders nothing because it goes, oh, I got nothing to map over. Now, we get all of this data from the roster, It comes back, we set it to players, and magically this re-renders. That is the relationship. So while a bunch of you are doing the filtering on the front end, if you do it on the back end, and imagine that the response coming from API/roster just magically has only the things we're looking to filter out and display, this will just appear to be filtering, but really every web request is going and coming back with less and less results. Some people have asked, why would you do that? Why can't I just hide the results on the front end? Well, if you search YouTube, which has umpteen million videos, do you think that they're going to send you umpteen million videos and then just display none a whole bunch of them? Right? It sounds ridiculous, but we don't know how many players are on the team here. We don't know how many badges are coming across from the app. So if this was wired up to a real database and people could go and use a content management system and load up that database with all the different badges of the university, there'd be hundreds of thousands of potential results. We have to filter it out. Think of the university library. University library stitches together 7 really dense data systems so that if you search for a book or a periodical or a journal entry or something, it's doing all of that processing and then returns, right? We're not filtering out on the front end. You could filter on the front end for very, very simple, limited subsets of data if you really wanted to, right? This could be a series of tags are displayed, and that tags like, thing, stuff, whatever. We've got like 6 of them, and you go, all right, I'm just going to do a drop down. Just show me the things that have this tag, right? And on the front end, we go, well, we've only given you 50 results. Oh, let's just filter it to these 5 visually. That could be a more legitimate reason for doing front end filtering. Generally, you're not going to do that though. Okay. So I need something with search here. Okay, so I've got my team, and we're going to put in search widget. And I knew what I was going to type. All right. Right. And I'm going to do @value change. I'm listening for that event on the tag in question. Okay. e.detail.value. And look, it knows what it's going to write. So that's why I'm just going to let it keep doing its thing here. Yeah, that is more or less what I was going to write. So many of you said, how do I get that value sent to the backend, right? To vercel. And this is how, with a query parameter. So I'm fetching the address. In this case, I'm doing it when the search is handled, right? So you type, event bubbles up, I listen for the event, right? Then I react to the event by taking the value and wiring that into the address and then making the request. Then the onus is on the back end to do something with this. Now, this has handle search, and I'm going to clean this up a little bit, right? So I'm going to say handle search event, and then I'm going to make a refactor, because personally, I don't like doing stuff like that, right? I've got 2 fetches in here. Like there's update roster, and then there's this other thing. So instead, I'm going to make like a get search results, and that's going to take a value generically. Now, already knew what it's going to do. All right, get search results is going to be async. It's going to return a value. So I'm going to take in a value of some kind, right? And this, I'm refactoring right now. It's a very common type of operation, right? So get search results. So in the end, I'm going to set this .players to data. Now, I could do that at the end of get search results. Or if I make this async and we await the fetch, and instead, all right, at the end of this, we just return data. The way that this promise is going to work, let's do const data. So we're results. How about that? Different variables, so it's less confusing. Okay, so I'm going to do get search results. Now this refactor allows me to throw away almost all of this code. So now I can do this dot get search results using e.detail.value. Now I'm going to get rid of that line. And this is going to have to be async And we're going to say this dot players equals await results. And now here we're going to do return results. So reading what this is going to do, type in the search widget. Input event is translated to value changed event. Value changed event runs this method. This method, and it's important, it is this dot method, right? This is a method on the class that I'm working on. We're thinking of this tag as an object, and these are all the functions of that object. So if you are wondering why I put underscores, this is just like a general convention. This demarks that this is like a private event, or sorry, a private method. You can, in modern JavaScript, as of about a year ago of this recording in 2023, you can use private classes and have like private methods and private properties and things. I'm not doing that. We're still sticking with this. So this is just a convention. Anyone could call this, but it's to signal to other developers if they were to see it, hey, I don't need to, I shouldn't call that. I could, but I probably shouldn't. There should be some other way to access this. So this has to be async because I'm awaiting these results. Async await and these promises cascade. So I have to say, okay, this is called, treat it as asynchronous. So sit there and wait for results. This dot players, which is my array of values, is going to await getting search results relative to whatever the term that bubbled up. In this case, e.detail.value. Let's make it so we're crystal clear. Const term equals, right? So that is the search term. The search term gets passed into results. We then take the search term, we wire it into the roster, right? API/roster search. Then our fetch, instead of, right? So the promise is going to resolve. The promise is something you never break. I know. So you make a request, JavaScript keeps spinning and thinking, but this thread is hanging out there basically, and it's waiting for that response to come back. And then when the response comes back, we make sure that it's okay, which is the network saying, yep, the request went through. And then we return that as JSON. So you can keep chaining these thens together, like, okay, then do that, and you'll have access to whatever the return of the previous thing is, right? So fetch is returning response. The then logic here is returning the response as a JSON object. This then has access to that data, and I'm just returning that data directly. I could actually skip this step and just go to that. So instead of saying this.players equals data, because that could happen at any point in time, I don't know when that's going to occur, I'm saying, well, return the data. And this is saying, okay, results equals this, but if I just did this, results would become a promise. Because we await it, it's saying, yeah, it's a promise, but wait for the entire result to resolve, and then give me whatever that is. So if you think of our event loop, right, address is set. This code just sits here and waits. The rest of your application is still running, but this code is kind of locked, waiting. Oh, the results came in. Now I can keep moving forward. And because that cascades, I get the results as JSON data. I return the results to here, and I've awaited those results coming in. That then I call this.players. Now, a reason to potentially do this would be maybe I'm getting search results from different places. Maybe I want to make this generalized and reusable elsewhere. There's umpteen number of reasons to do an abstraction in this regard. But I get the search results. This is going to populate players. Now, if we look back up on update roster, I don't have any need for this anymore. So we just blow that away. There's, nope, I'm just going to set this to none. I'm not actually going to get any results until we have a value, although it's going to do it anyway. There's a default. So, okay. So now I'm updating players and I'm sending my value to the backend. I'm going to save that. Now, I'm going to, just to see what happens right now, we need to do some debugging. I'm going to npm start. Now, this is not going to let me have access to /API/roster. And yes, I know that's frustrating, but we are in front-end development land right now. So I inspect, and I'm going to get an error. Failed to load resource. It is in dev mode. And now if I go and I right click, okay, team roster, buttons, search widget. So if you see your tag in this case, and it doesn't have a shadow root like this does, that means the definition didn't load. Now, that could be any number of reasons why the definition didn't load. It could be that you didn't reference the code, like I didn't on purpose, right? So I can do this. I need to actually import search widget, right? So now I've imported search widget. Oh, it went away. Lovely. Search widget, error, 500. Super generic. Team roster. Okay, we call search widget. So now I know there's an error in search widget. If I open up my console, this told me. Now, the reason that it didn't know on the front end, and you see a 500 error, and this can be a clue if you see a 500 error in local development. If you got a 500 error, that means there was something so low level as far as the error, it couldn't even do the compiling to send you what the thing is that's wrong. That's real bad. And yes, I knew this was going to happen. So I look in the npm start, the terminal. You should look in your VS Code instance if you get a 500 error. And I go, oh, there's all this could not resolve import. But I imported that. And I put it in my package.json file. Now, if you get some message claiming code that should be there is not, you should npm install. Every time you git clone a project and it has a package.json, you have to run this command. Every time you modify the package.json, you have to run this command. It doesn't just automatically get the new versions. There are some things that do hot module reloading to do stuff like that. I don't personally trust that. It is possible, but okay, so that will have installed my icon library. And now, because I have my icon library, I'm able to get this code to at least run. Now, it's not, if I look at the network, there's no fetches, right? We're not getting anything. Now, let's see if anything happens. Change this. Oh, nope, got nothing in there. Okay. So I should be able to modify this, and we need to figure out, is this actually, is the code actually wired up? So the best way that I have of debugging that is the most brute force. I go through and I say console.log this.value. Okay. Too many of those windows. Oh, I see. I have multiple Drew cards open. That could be part of where I was getting some weirdness. See? Okay. So it is trying to do the submission, right? So I just keep doing console logs, like trace in your mind the way the code is structured. The events always go up, the properties always come down. And so, all right, that code got to there, value change fired, save. I'm going to go up to my team roster. And I already know that this relationship is wired up appropriately, not because of Copilot writing it, but because this is making a whole bunch of fetches, right? So, right, STU, every single key press. Now, I'm not going to get into debouncing. You could debounce the value so that you only submit it after like every 100 milliseconds or so that it reduces the number of requests we're sending out the door. I don't care about that for right now. So roster search stuff. Now, if you're running, and I'm on port 8000, port 8000 is npm start. This is front-end development. That call is going to the backend or the microservice, right? API/roster. That's not running right now. So our way, of hopefully resolving that is, let's try one trick. Let's see, I forget if this will work, but I'm gonna run vercel dev. Vercel dev is going to compile my front end code, but also set up the back end. Now this will tell me if my little roll up compiling thing works at all. Sweet, I can go to localhost 3000. Sweet, I hit console, right? Let network, and I can see that that goes out the door. So we're pretty close, right? It got results and it updated and you saw it flash. Now, it's not doing anything differently. And that's because now I can finally work on the back end of the application. So in my general workflow, I'm doing stuff on the front end and making sure these assets and the events and things work. And then when I get to that point where it goes to the back end, in the previous video, that's where I switch from it being delivered from a JSON file to I switch over to vercel dev and act like it's a server. So I'm done with port 8000 now. And I'm going to terminate that. Okay. So I've got localhost 3000. Just make sure I've got it all in one place. It's not requesting initially because I took out that, hey, go get data, right? Now, if you wanted it to go get data even without results, I've kind of caused myself a problem now. I'm going to say, hey, go get the results of this. Sure. Hey. Syntax error. And this isn't going to rebuild anyway because it's static, right? So if I make these changes now, because I'm only running vercel, I have to stop this, rebuild. And it's going to say there's a syntax error anyway. There we go. So if you get a hard brick on vercel dev, it's because you have a critical syntax error. Go back to npm start, work as a front end developer. Now, this failed because I have this.players await. And the only way to make things await is if they're async. And guess what? Because of the way class architecture works, you can't do this. You can't make, and it says async modifier cannot appear on the constructor declaration. Now there are ways to cheat this, but for now, I'm going to try to just do it this way and see if it works. I don't actually think it will, but just see if that causes problems. All right, so I'm not awaiting the results. It just says, hey, this players equals this thing. It's going to go off and do its thing, hopefully. And if we inspect, let's say we should get an error. All right, in this case, because the word term is not defined. So let's just make the search have nothing. And then in get results for value, let's do equals that. So you can set a default value on this side. And in part, I'm doing this to show you how obnoxious it is to make these small, completely front-end changes with vercel, right? I have to keep reloading it in this environment. I haven't built something that nicely stitches the two together yet. Let's see. Okay. That's what I was assuming would happen. So if I go into my elements, let's take team roster, store as a global value, which is via right click, and I do dot players, we have a promise. And this is what I mean with async awaits. This is going to say, yeah, but that's a promise. It's not done yet. And so it just says, oh, well, I'm a promise then. So I could call that, and I'm kind of riffing here, dot then results. I think I could do it this way safely. Let's see. Again, with the vercel dev. I know that part's annoying, but we are also doing multiple job categories simultaneously. All right, let's see if that worked. Hello. So I'm in the constructor. I have this. I'm not calling it via async await. It's a promise. But because it's a promise, much like fetch has a promise, that means I can go, okay, well, yeah, do your promise thing. Then when you have the results, which I will have, then that's when I'm going to do this. So this allows me to sort of cheat on that convention and leverage the code in the way that the objects are intended to be used. So now it's going to make this call initially. It goes out the door. I can see this when I inspect value. And we go network. We can see a call goes out the door with no input in it. So now we can work on the back end code. Okay, so we know the front end is going to go and it's going to make requests with all this stuff. So to work on the back end code, I'm in the API directory. In this case, I have a roster. All right, and just to illustrate that I can actually get multiple things to show up, right, I'm going to add another one. When I hit save, this doesn't reload. But now, if I search for something different, I get the other result. So this code is run live, right, for the back end. Again, very confusing, I know. I'm on port 3000. That's another signifier that I'm on compiled code with vercel. The back end is alive. The front end is not. So now we've got to get that value, that search value. So if I look at my network request, right, it's in something called search in the query parameters. So the way to get access to that, and this is another way you can do debugging as well. So I'm going to have this terminal window open over there and do this on this side, right? So what's that? So I get some more real estate. I'm going to do console.log request.query.search. So let's just do request.query. Save. So I hit save, nothing occurs, but now let's make a request. I get console output, but I'm on a server. Well, this terminal window is showing the server in this case. So I can now be writing code for Node.js on a live backend. That live backend runs the code when this endpoint gets hit. And now I'm able to output what is going on at that stage of the transaction, right? So again, it's spamming. All those requests go out the door. Those requests are processed on the back end in that API directory, and I see the search result here. So this is true of any query parameters you'd send up. Some of you have like type involved, and type is coming across. You'd be able to do request.query.type. And the reason I can do that request in the first place, or some of the examples have REQ, that is just, this is a little bit of the magic of how vercel handles things, but it's running an Express-based backend. Express is a very lightweight server, boils everything down to a handler that has a request that came across and the response to send back. So I've got the search term, I've got my roster. There are a couple different ways you could do this. I'm going to make an index because I talked about making an index in class. So to make an index, I'm going to do it this way. Now, my definition of index is taking every property and smashing it into one value. There are other ways to do filtering, but I'm going to do it this way. So instead of a const roster, let's just do var roster. And the reason is if I manipulate roster and it's constant. It's not supposed to change. It could get ticked off at me. Although the constant doesn't apply to the objects in the array, but it's neither here nor there. Let's just avoid any possible issues. So I'm going to do roster.map and say, hey, for each map there's a player. And that is not what I was going to do, but that's interesting that it would suggest that. So this is where Copilot can get confused, just so we're perfectly clear. New URL, there's no concept of that here. I'm on backend code. This is Node.js. It's highly similar to JavaScript. It is not the same as front-end JavaScript. So what I'm going to do, though, is I do have access to things like that, like a map, right? Just like we do in our render function. So I'm going to do player.index. Oh, there's a good first one, right? So I can take the index. I'm going to say, well, the name, even if the name is Drew, if you type a lowercase d, it should still show up. It shouldn't be just uppercase things. So let's rename some of these people. Hey, it knew it should be Lemieux, even though I misspelled it. And position, we'll say defense. And Mario Lemieux is position is that. Include values, position is overpaid. Okay, and then stats label can be the same for these. And then the top part of his beast. Amazing. Right, acceptable teacher. So it's going to print those out. We've got these other values. I don't really want you to be able to search on image. I don't want you to be able to search on stats label. What the hell do I care about that? But name, position, the top value, which in this case gets wired into my meme. You probably don't have anything like that. I do want to filter on those. So my index, I'm going to like this, right? Player name dot to lowercase. All right, position. Okay, knew I wanted that. That's nice. Let's see what the other one says. Top. So good. It's listening to me. All right. So those are the three I want: position, name, top. So this is one way of writing this, right? Take that value to lowercase, to lowercase, to lowercase. So then this will go through the roster, and every single one of these will then have an index as well. So to verify this, I'm going to console.log roster. And query, I'm going to do .search because that's what's coming across there. And then we're going to say, we want that to be lowercase as well. Okay, so now we do this, I make some changes, it's updated on the front end. We can see now I've got an index, right? So the index is Drew Dowdy overpaid beast. This way, when I do the search comparison to all this gobbledygook, I have one thing that I can do the comparison to. All the other fields are there, but if these fields, if it shows up in here somewhere, then I can start to apply an array filter and say, oh, it shows up in here, keep it. Oh, it doesn't show up in there, get rid of it. And that, when sending to the front end with less values, will automatically refresh because of the way the render function works, because I'm setting that data into JSON. The JSON's going into an array. The array is automatically re-rendering. So, and I say, I don't really want to do it that way, but so let's do this. Let's say const search equals, oh, and that's another, this is another convention you might see occasionally. This is, we'll do this, and it's an or statement, which looks really weird in context here, but like, if this has no value, then just set it to nothing so that at least it isn't null, right? So think of this as this is true if any value exists of any kind. If search didn't come across in the query, well, we want to make sure it's at least nothing in this case. So other fun with confusing syntax, I could put those and do that. Okay, the result of this is going to either be an empty string or it's going to be the search term. Make that lowercase. Do it that way. But again, just so we see some variability. So you can chain these things together. So now my search term, I'm going to apply to this. Now I'm going to do roster.filter. It already knows what I'm going to write. Okay. Okay. So the way you do a filter is, so I'm not going to use that filter, but the way it's suggesting I do the filter is return player.index.index of search lower term, or search dot to lowercase is greater than -1. Actually, I will do that. And then we're going to see if we just return roster correctly, actually. All right, so let's save. And now we'll still allow our console logs. And now we've got a search that only returns Mario Lemieux, or only returns Drew, or if it's nothing, all of those have nothing in them, or a space. They all have a space in it, right? And now I get defense, but I can also get partial. So if I say DEF, DE, just the letter D, right? D is in Drew Dowdy, but it's also in defense, which is over in this one. Right, but it also can do partials, right? So L is in real, but it's also in Lemieux. Now, if I do space L, right, Mario space Lemieux. So understanding what is going on with this filter. Filter is going to go through the array. And if this returns true, it means keep that value. If it returns false, it means get rid of that value. So if player dot index index of, which is something you can run on a string. So index of search term, which came across, to lowercase, so that we're lowercase on both sides of this. And it's greater than -1, because if I look for the index of something, if that index doesn't exist, it doesn't return false, because false could be 0, which could be the first part of the array, like the first position, because array position 0 in a string, right? So the string can be treated as an array. The first character is actually 0. So if it's not -1, meaning it found it somewhere, return true. Otherwise, return false. Right, so that is effectively what it could be. Whatever your comparison is, if you want to do it on each individual field, then go for it. Right? So I'm just showing one way to do the index and finding that thing to do the filtering. But notice all the filtering happens on the back end. The front end doesn't have any connotation of what it's rendering. It's just rendering results. And that's an important lines of separation when doing any application development, going forward, right? If I can just send you data as an API, this is way more flexible. I can have a different team work on this. We can have a whiteboarding session around the API for our element on the front end, and the design team is separate from the database team delivering this on the back end. So one more small cleanup here. Another way I could write this is I could use template literal syntax, just like we use on the front end, which is that backtick. And I could say player name, and then player dot position, and then player dot top. Much cleaner there, right? I could also keep the index pure, and I could say, well, make the index, make it lowercase, the index of the lowercase thing compared to the search lowercase thing, right? So there's lots of different ways to write these things. I'm gonna clean that up. So minimalist, I try to go for the minimum amount of effort. Think of like Deadpool jumping off the bridge, maximum effort. Outputting the roster here is nice for debugging purposes. If there's an error on the front end, you could work on this on the back end. I could also go to these paths. Now, it might do what it just did there, which is like, that's not what it rendered, but it's because of caching. So Control-Shift-R says, oh, well, there wasn't anything. But if I type Mar for Mario, right, there's my result. That's what's coming from it. So you could develop these things headlessly, as another term, industry term for it. So by headless development or API first development, there's microservice type of architecture, you could just work on the back end and just look at the way you analyze the API in the search results, right? I'm looking at this and I could go type equals blue, right? I could send other values over, and now I'm making an API for communication with the front end dev team. Hey, if you get data from this address, it'll be in this format, and you'll be able to work with it this way. It could be with post versus get. This is a get request as far as having the parameters here. Now, there's a whole industry around this notion. I've covered it in past versions of this class. We don't have time to get to it, but I do want to at least mention it. It's called Open API, an Open API spec, and Open API specification. So Open API is an API for APIs. It's very trippy. Sometimes it's referenced as Swagger, is another name for it. But explore Swagger tools. No, I don't want to get a free API account. Come on. Sure. We're getting really into the weeds with it. Let me show you what it ends up looking like. It's a standard. Okay, here we go. Yes, so it's much more a standard way of saying this is what my API can do and what you can do with it. It's a way of advertising to things By things, I mean people consuming your API. You could just build an API that is for use by other people to use your API. This is how YouTube works, right? I have to get a key for YouTube if I'm using it outside of youtube.com. And I can display search results in other areas. I believe I've showed this in class, but if I go to the Hacks platform and I want to search for YouTube, I can actually search YouTube in context and get results. And what this little widget's doing that you are writing a very similar sort of thing is, right? Making a request, it's got a search key involved, and it's got something that implies, in this case, you see at the end of that potentially Q equals hacks the web. That's the query parameter. Give me only 20 results. The front end on my side goes, hey, I got 20 results and I'm going to render them. But I could do some front end filtering to be like, yeah, I only want 10, right? I don't know how many you're going to send me. So understanding that contract and negotiating that between front end and back end. Here's the results. Here's how many results. Display. Probably want to do filtering on the API side so that we can hit maximum scalability. All very important. Now, if we want an example of something that isn't doing back-end filtering, it would be this little widget that I have here. So we've got 10 things displayed. If I actually go back, now we've got like 60 things displayed, and in the future we could have several hundred here. Maybe I only want to display a couple. So this isn't hitting an endpoint. This is just filtering the results in place. So that if I type the word block quote, right, everything with the word block is what shows up. We get down to quote. All right, we have two different types of block quotes in this case. Or if I type card, but much like the index idea on the backend side, right, this is now searching off of one of those other properties in there. So I made an index of a whole bunch of things. So this one purely front end, the one that we're doing purely back end driven. And this whole thing is part of a larger concept of micro front end web development. So I hope this is enough for you to be able to build the search side of this. Catch you later.